皆様こんにちは。
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming to our meeting, Offshore Wind at New Stage, Policy and Institutional Design for Scalable Deployment.
Mainly speaking in Japanese, so please use the headsets for English translations.
My name is Izumi Tanaka from the Renewable Energy Institute, and I will be serving as your MC today. Before we start the seminar, I was just informed just now, Mr. O from Vestas will not be able to make it for this seminar, so he will be absent. So I would like to apologize for that. Amid rising oil prices, the question of how to ensure a stable energy supply has once again become a major global concern. Japan is no exception. In fact, because Japan depends heavily on imported energy resources, it is particularly vulnerable to price volatility and supply risks. Globally, energy policy is now at the major turning point, shaped not only by climate action, but also by geopolitical considerations such as energy security and industrial competitiveness. In Japan as well, rising oil prices, potential future supply risks, and their economic impacts have made it increasingly clear that energy is directly linked to national security. Against this backdrop, offshore wind is being positioned in many countries as a key pillar that can contribute not only to decarbonization but also to strengthening energy security, as it is a domestically producible energy source. In Japan, policy and institutional reforms aimed at expanding offshore wind deployment are also progressing, and the sector is entering a new stage of development. Today, drawing on the experiences and latest policy developments from the United Kingdom and Denmark, both leaders in offshore wind, we hope to deepen the discussion on the policy frameworks and institutional design needed to sustainable and large-scale deployment of offshore wind in Japan. With that, let us move on to the first session.
The stage. 最初のスピーカーは世界風力エネルギー会議
Our first speaker is Rebecca Williams, Deputy CEO of the Global Wind Energy Council, GWEC. GWEC is the global industry association representing the wind sector and works closely with governments and international organizations to promote the expansion of wind power worldwide. Rebecca has been at the forefront of global offshore wind policy discussions and has been deeply involved in policy and market design debates across regions including Asia Pacific, Europe, and the United States. Today, she will speak about AR7, the United Kingdom's 7th offshore wind allocation round, whose results were announced in January. This round attracted significant attention as a major policy effort to enable large-scale offshore wind deployment while addressing rising costs and improving the institutional framework, resulting in the largest ever allocation of around 8.4 gigawatt of offshore. Obayashi will be moderating the session. Rebecca, please.
Minasan, konnichiwa. Hello, everyone. And I'm delighted to see so many of you in the audience today to learn about the topic of allocation round 7 in the UK and the wider topic of offshore wind. Tanaka-san just gave an excellent introduction, but I think the key thing also to bear in mind is that we're meeting today, all of us, at a time of profound geopolitical uncertainty. And a lot of the things that we knew about the way that the world worked are now changing. And I think it's an important backdrop for us to have these conversations about how we will upscale offshore wind. And obviously, there's been some challenges to the offshore wind sector here in Japan. some very well-reported challenges. But what we see now is some new green shoots of recovery. And because of also this wider conversation around energy security and strengthening the indigenous resources and the resilience here in Japan, I think it's a really important moment that we have this conversation about how we upscale offshore wind. So today I'm going to give you some practical content, some detailed content about the way things have worked in the UK. That's not to say that everything that I will present today will apply in the Japanese case, but rather in sharing these learnings, I hope that that enriches the discussion and that some of the trial and error that we've experienced in the UK can be helpful in guiding and contributing to a successful series of next steps here in Japan as METI considers its next steps around how to go forward with auction design, auction reform, etc. So that's the wider background to the presentation that I'm about to give. And I believe there will be some time for questions. I'm looking at the moderators. Yes, at some point during the panel discussion. Just a word on who GWEC is. So GWEC stands for the Global Wind Energy Council. We're the global industry body for the wind sector. We work with major institutions such as the International Energy Agency, the UN, and others to represent the interests of the wind sector. But we also focus on how to grow wind in emerging markets around the world. We have many corporate members who are some of the biggest companies in the wind energy space. And we also have a network of different associations that form part of our membership. And earlier today, in fact, I've just come from there, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the Japan Wind Power Association to strengthen our collaboration when it comes to bringing these international learnings into Japan's energy industry. That was a really exciting, important moment for us. At the same time, we're represented here in Japan by Matsuki-san, who is our country manager and leads all of our activities here in Japan. And he's already been instrumental in helping support the Japanese industry by establishing a bridging forum, which is a all-encompassing dialogue when it comes to offshore wind, bringing together the supply chain developers, financiers, and many others in order to push forward offshore wind in Japan. So thank you for allowing me to give you that background, and hopefully it sets the context for this discussion. In this presentation, I'm going to give you a reminder of what happened in allocation round 5. I'm going to then talk about some of the key themes of the UK's energy policy and overall what's the UK trying to achieve in its energy policy. And then I'm going to come on to considering allocation round 7, how that reform has happened, and ultimately what that means. So cast your mind back to the year 2023. I don't know if you can remember what you were doing at that time. It seems like a very long time ago. But in AR5, allocation round 5, essentially in the UK, we had a colossal auction failure occur. And the UK, along with some other European countries, such as Denmark, I know we'll hear from the Danish example a little bit later on, have really been at the forefront of developing offshore wind over the previous years. So we have a considerable history of developing offshore wind. So you can imagine how embarrassing this moment of failure was for the UK, which has put itself really, or thinks of itself as the world leader when it comes to offshore wind. The political situation was quite different. During that time, we had a different party in government in the UK. So this was under the Conservative Party, and the Prime Minister at the time was Rishi Sunak. In 2024, the government then changed. We had a general election and a new Prime Minister came in. So just please bear that in mind as I describe also what's happening here. But essentially, that auction was a failure. No bids at all came forward for offshore wind. The industry unanimously rejected what the government had set out in terms of the offer because the risk-reward balance in the auction was just not there. It was a very shaky case. And bidders rejected it because they couldn't see that route to market and long-term viability for their projects at a time when inflation was rising, when some of the fundamental other infrastructure challenges around grid, etc., were not in place. So you can see some of the headlines from the time here. It was extremely well reported in the UK and was front page news that the auction had failed. So then, fast forward a year, there was a new government in Parliament, and really a resetting of the agenda and a really promising opportunity to put a different set of circumstances in place and to really learn the lessons of what had happened in that auction failure and put in place reform to move the market on. I'm now just going to talk to you a little bit about what the UK is seeking to achieve overall in its energy policy, as I mentioned. The new government came into power with a mandate of strong action on climate change and also to tackle energy security. And in fact, they made offshore wind one of the key pillars of their manifesto promise. So this was a fundamentally important issue for the UK government when it came in. You can see here the change that had already happened in the UK's generation mix. For those of you who visited the UK, you will know that we are a windy, rainy island who's blessed with very good wind resources. And it's been a moment to make the most of those resources. So you can see that in 2013, we had relatively small amounts of wind, but by 2023, that had grown hugely to the bars you see here. At the same time, what happened as a result of this wind power mix was also a massive reduction in CO2 emissions against a 1990 baseline. So the UK has also been very successful at reducing emissions and decoupling economic growth from emissions. And since 2024 and this government change, as I said, there's been some other really key milestones. So in part, you could argue that one of the reasons that offshore wind became very successful, the imperative for offshore wind to succeed in the UK, was because we actually had a ban on onshore wind in place for quite some time. So for a period of quite a few years, onshore wind was banned in the UK, and solar was also effectively banned. So large-scale solar was also banned. When the new government came in, they very quickly overturned that ban on onshore wind and solar. And so that also gave a boost to the market in terms of really boosting investor confidence across the suite of renewables, and also sends a powerful signal to international investors that the UK was going to, again, be a safe place to invest money. Again, when the government came in, they quickly tried to address the failures that we'd seen in allocation round 5, and they ran another auction quite quickly after that. This was allocation round 6. And I'll just go on. I know I'm using quite a lot of technical terms here. I will explain some of these in a moment or two. But very quickly after that new government, they ran another auction, also allocation round 6, where one of the key changes that was made was around indexation of the prices in the auction. In allocation round 5, there'd been very little indexation of prices. And so when these macroeconomic impacts had hit the wind sector, there was no way for investors to deal with those apart from to try and absorb the cost themselves. So that left investments exposed, and it was a huge challenge for the sector, which is why you also saw no bids, as I said, in allocation round 5. So as a result of that change, what was really positive was then 9.6 gigawatts of renewables, so offshore wind, onshore wind, and solar was also then achieved in allocation round 6. As I mentioned, there was also planning permission given on the solar side as well. And then also crucially in 2024, wind actually became the biggest generation source in the UK, bigger than gas, bigger than any other form of generation, signaling a really powerful moment of what the wind industry had achieved and also what it could continue to do. The incoming government also set a new target. So the UK has long had offshore wind targets, which are backed up by the targets that are outlined in the Climate Change Act. So the UK has a Climate Change Act, and that sets overall emissions targets. And then there's other sector-specific targets that dovetail with that overall act. There's strong offshore wind targets, and also now we have this ambition for clean power by 2030, which is the decarbonisation of the entire power sector by 2030. And as you can see here on this slide, offshore wind deployment from 2000 to 2030 has grown exponentially during that time, so from 10 gigawatts up to 35 gigawatts under that clean power scenario. So I won't spend too long on this slide, but just a moment to talk about how the auction works. In the UK, we have a two-sided CFD auction. The UK has pioneered this approach when it comes to two-sided CFDs. And actually recently, in the Hamburg Declaration in the North Sea Energy Cooperation Agreement signed earlier this year, we've seen a commitment from other North Sea countries to work towards also putting in place two-sided CFDs, because they've become the recognized benchmark, at least in Europe, of how to structure contracts when it comes to wind. I'm just going to move through some of these slides because I've already had a 5-minute warning from the back and I don't want to spend too much time. So maybe just then moving on to the AR7 results. So against the backdrop that I just described, we had a failed auction round in AR7. We then had some learnings taken forward to AR6, but there were still some problems that needed to be addressed. In AR7, what happened was that the government and industry came together to have a very strong dialogue of how to address some of these problems. And the result was that this became the largest ever successful offshore wind auction in the world, indeed renewables auction. We had 8 successful projects, including 6 fixed bottom projects and 2 floating projects. You can see the price achieved in each of the auctions here on the screen. There are some different pricing for Scotland, which is in the far north of the UK, versus the rest of the UK. I'll come on to talk about that in a second. And also then the price for floating wind achieved there. But crucially, this also has provided enough power to power 9.7 million homes around the UK, is expected to provide 7,000 jobs and to abate 12 million tonnes of CO2. So, how was this success achieved? Because that's, I think, what you all want to know. And how could this apply to the Japanese case? So some overarching points and then some more specific points. First of all, there was a very strong dialogue between government and industry happening on a near daily basis in order to try and fix some of these problems. And what's been really encouraging for me this week, being here in Tokyo, is I feel that we're now at a point where government and industry here in Japan are also having a really strong dialogue. So I think this is crucially important to be able to address some of these problems and to spot problems before they then get to this failed auction stage. Like I said, these discussions have been absolutely constant via the different renewables associations and also via the Offshore Wind Industry Council in the UK. The other piece that I think has been crucial to resetting expectations around AR7 is that the industry has really stepped up in its leadership around communicating to the public, communicating to journalists, but also in working together to give the government what it needs to make the case to its electorate. And this has taken place by the commissioning of studies, by lots of outreach, and by also having this continuous dialogue, not just with government, but also with people. The way that the offshore wind sector has now structured itself in the UK, there are many different hubs which are based around ports. So these are all backed also by a local enterprise partnership, leading to this cluster model of industrial innovation and regeneration. And I think that's really provided a very supportive public up and down the UK to work with when it comes to how locally people are benefiting from the offshore wind industry. The other key point here is that the UK system has always been relatively good at setting out that long-term trajectory for auction timetables and parameters, setting out how much will be procured in each auction. But actually, it's got even better at that. So it's now running auctions every year. There's advance notice of what that auction schedule looks like. And the crucial thing there is that it means that supply chain can invest because you have confidence that that auction will happen and ultimately that you will get your return on investment. Looking into some of the specific reforms, and I've been told to stop talking very soon, is that floating wind has been moved into a separate pot. So in the CFD auction, there are different pots according to the technologies. offshore wind was placed into its own pot. Previously in AR5, it had to compete against onshore wind and solar, which are two much more mature technologies. So that undercut the value for offshore wind. Offshore wind was also fast-tracked and was split into a different auction timing to really bring forward offshore wind. The contract length, which was 15 years, was also extended to 20 years in order to ensure that the merchant tail risk was also addressed, and that it's hoped that that would have impacts on reduced cost of capital. There are also higher strike prices to take account of macroeconomic conditions. There was also a budget outline, but the Secretary of State, so the Energy Minister in the UK, also had powers to increase that budget if certain criteria were met. So this concludes my presentation, partly. There were more slides, but I'd be happy to share these with you after the presentation, and we can come on to some of it in a moment or two in the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Rebecca, thank you very much.
You can have the headset. Yeah.
I would like to ask you some questions. AR7, the substance and content and designing of the AR7 was explained, and also there were many successful awardees, and there are several factors which contributed to success. But in a nutshell, simply put, such a large-scale awards, 8.4 gigawatt. What was the most important factor which contributed to this successful bidding in your view? Auction, CFD, is used in the case of the UK. Auction itself had a major impact, or maybe the seabed areas determination, and also improving project maturity. I think there are various factors which can contribute to the successful bidding. So the auction designing itself, or early stage mechanism which improved project maturity and so forth, which is the biggest impact factor?
Very good question. I'm not sure that I can say that there was one single biggest factor, because actually I believe it was the combination of factors and the industry working together very strongly in this joint dialogue with government, which meant that those benefits could be achieved. So I think it was that, and also, as I said, having that long-term confidence in the market, which is set out by the size of projects, the volume of projects, and having that auction schedule way ahead of time. So I think it's that. I think it's the dialogue between industry and government in order to address some of those mistakes and failures, and also the long-term schedule that has been set out.
We
have a discussion to follow. 6.9 giga, if I remember correctly, was awarded to RWE, and the person from the RWE will be participating in the panel discussion later on. So I'll ask a question later on. But there are the awardees who received a huge portion, and also there will be following bidders in the future. So this is going to be a long-term prospect and predictability. And I think they may understand such a long-term confidence in the system is working very well.
Yes, I think so. I think there is that long-term confidence also in the UK as a place that has the rule of law, is a good place to invest, and where the government and industry can work together in that way. And I think that those things are really important, but also that Japan has some of those key things as well. So I think that's a big opportunity. When it comes to that kind of long-term dialogue, I think there are, still challenges that exist to solve in the UK. A big one of those being grid and grid charging. But the UK is undergoing some reforms in that area at the moment, and hopefully from those reforms we'll see some blueprints and some clarity provided to investors, which can also then form part of additional learnings.
Thank you very much. We will be asking you more questions during the panel discussion later on. Now,
and then please talk about the Danish how can I say, the formulation of the new policy. お願いいたします。
Thank you very much, Mika-san. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name is William Lim. I represent the Danish Energy Agency. The Danish Energy Agency is the national energy agency of Denmark that plans, tenders, awards, and permits all energy projects in the country. And so everything related to offshore wind is obviously also under our purview. Before I go into details, there's an important disclaimer I want to make. Our Prime Minister, not too long ago, decided to call for an election, which means that there are strong restrictions as to topics I can touch upon. Number one. Number two, we have a current live tender going on in Denmark, which according to EU regulations also imposes a lot of restrictions as to what topics I can touch upon in this regard. So nothing in this presentation here should be interpreted, construed, or relied upon as constituting any official interpretation of, clarification of, or amendment to the tender material, or any documentation related thereto. Furthermore, nothing herein shall be deemed to constitute new information or in connection with the aforementioned tender process. My good colleagues asked me to make this presentation a little fun because we're all a little jet-lagged. For a bit of context, what is Denmark and what are we doing? So just a quick reminder, a little bit of background and context. The climate goal that we're working on as a country is set out in the Climate Act that was adopted in 2020. And the goal was to reduce, still is, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by 2030 versus 90 levels, and to become climate neutral by 2050. The graph you see on the right-hand side is not targets, but it's some of the model assumptions that we at the Danish Energy Agency work with and that we provide to our TSO and Energinet for them to do their planning. And so what you see here is obviously a very ambitious expansion of offshore wind in the years to come. When the current construction of the to date largest single offshore project in Denmark, Project Thor, is completed in 2027, we would have 3.7 gigawatts of offshore wind in operation in Denmark, just to put a little bit of context to that. So, I think, as Rebecca briefly mentioned, and probably you may know if you follow the wind industry, offshore wind industry closely, is that we had a zero bid situation in December of 2024. I will refrain from putting any adjectives to that, but the situation was we had 6 gigawatt out for tender, and we received 0 bids. We had originally set a deadline for completion or commercial operation date for 2030, which was not really something that developers liked. And so we've changed the plans. We went from 6 gigawatts of offshore capacity to be tendered down to 2.8 gigawatt in this new tender that we recently launched. We've also extended the deadline or the timeline for when these projects should come online. And we have introduced the subsidies in the form of a CFD to these projects. And some of you might remember back in 2024, the tenders we had out were 0 subsidy tenders. And so we could see how much the world has changed just over the course of a year. So what was the process, actually? So what happened? What you see here is basically what happened over the past year. We received 0 bids in 5th of December. And then the DEA quickly began to figure out what actually happened. Why was there no tender? What were the industry's concerns? What were their priorities? We had done some internal analysis, but we've also commissioned external parties to do an analysis for us to map out issues and topics that we needed to change in order for us to be successful with the offshore wind projects. So this is, by and large, the process that we followed, or that took place. So high-level conclusions from what actually from what came out of our internal analysis as well as the external, with three. You can roughly categorize them in three buckets. One is that the project profitability were challenged, zero subsidy. On the other hand, the award criteria for the old projects were concession payments. So under those circumstances, those projects were not profitable for developers. Timeline and flexibility was mentioned as another category of concerns. One was obviously supply chain bottlenecks that we have all read and heard about. And there was also a desire for the government to keep having a visible pipeline of projects to be tendered such that it would be easier for developers to plan and so on. And then there were a number of other conditions such as risk sharing and so on and so forth. And so at a very high level, what did we change? What did we come from? And what did we change it into? So a few things here. One is to go down in volume. So 6 gigawatts were a lot for the industry to cope. So we turned it down to 2.8. We scrapped the 20% state ownership requirement that we had in the previous tender to 0. We reintroduced a subsidy scheme in the form of a CFD with a total cap. So the government decided to set aside a budget that when it's depleted, then there would be no more subsidies to give to those projects. The award criteria was changed from the highest annual payment to the government to the lowest strike price as a consequence of introducing the CFD. And then there were some changes to the commercial operation dates as well for the various projects. So very high level, these were some of the changes that were adopted. And so I'd like to say a few words about the CFD, and in the Danish case, the capabilities-based CFD, which is, as far as I know, is the first one in action. Belgium has talked about it as well, and we have it now out in a live tender. And so when we look at CFDs, and this is really very high level and simplified comparison. And so there are a lot of technical and economic and legal nuances that are obviously left out in this presentation. And so the comparisons you see here are very stylized. So largely you can split or divide CFDs up into two buckets. One is the production-based CFD, and the other one is a capability-based. The production-based essentially is that the operator is incentivized to produce as much as possible, because the more they produce, the more they could potentially get. Whereas the capabilities is based on not what they actually did produce, but what they could have produced. And so there's a nuance there that is quite interesting. And again, there are a lot of details here that I probably will not go into, but one of the things that I want you to pay attention to is during the low wind situation, the capability-based CFD allows the operator to actually submit a price, not produce, buy alternate production, and still get some payment from the subsidy scheme. This is not permitted under the capability-based CFD. And so that changes a lot of behavior in how operators, they actually play the market, so to say. So Rebecca had a slide that was similar to this, was a CFD, and I think I'll skip that. But I think one of the important things to remember is a CFD actually only works when you have a liquid and dynamic power market, some level of volatility. That's where really the CFD can come to its rights. Very quick word on the Danish power markets before I go into how the CFD works. So we have a number of markets in Denmark. The ones that I'd like to touch upon briefly here would be the day-ahead market, the intraday market, and balancer market. And for the case of the CFD, more interesting is probably the day-ahead market that I'll try to wrap around as a context for understanding the capability-based CFD. So what's the problem with the production-based CFD, which we had before? And I'll jump straight to the conclusions. You can read you can see the illustrations there. But the problem with the production-based CFD is that we can potentially end in a situation where we have underutilized renewable capacity. So what does that mean? So for instance, when the wind is low and the prices are high, we could see a situation where the operator would commit to deliver power to the system, but they will not use their wind assets to do that. They would buy cheaper or a different form of production to deliver on their commitment, but still get the full payment from the government. Net, that means that they will actually be able to get a higher compensation for the power that they have delivered. So that's the production-based CFD. So we have a situation where assets are there, they could produce, but they're not. So from a socioeconomic perspective, that is suboptimal, and that is not in line with what we intended to do with a fleet of renewable assets. A capability-based, we try to address this price distortion, you can say. We would say, okay, in high wind situations, when prices are high, you'll still get what you are supposed to do, but you have to deliver using your wind turbines. And you're not allowed to buy alternate production to deliver to the market. And so that, in essence, is the difference between a production-based and a capability-based CFD. And so again, this is a very simplified, very stylized comparison between the two. There are a lot of smart minds that have spent hours and hours and hours researching into this. There's a big behavioral element in this, obviously. And again, this is because the Danish power market has the context that it has and the dynamics that it has. So with that, that was basically what happened over the last year, where we went from no subsidy to a capability-based CFD that is trying to change some of the dynamics in the behavior of the operators with the purpose of making sure that we are capitalizing on all the renewable assets that we have installed. And so the road to retender, as I call it, from a zero-bid situation to hopefully some bids when the first deadline arises or comes in May of this year, is that we will hopefully get some bids for 2 projects that we currently have out. So that concludes my presentation.
You can stay there. Okay, but I'm trying to ask you in English, actually. So in Denmark, that you have explained us that system was reviewed following the kind of previous tender, but very frankly, why it happens that? What do you think about that? The result of the zero bid. What's the kind of major reasons?
You mean for the 24?
Yeah.
I think I'll go back to the slide that I showed, which is it was a combination of costs that rendered the project unprofitable, unattractive from an investment standpoint. There was a bottleneck issue, and then there was generally, as a consequence of number one, a risk sharing that the market found was unbalanced.
Okay.
So those were the 3 categories of topics, you can say.
Sorry, that you expect that in this new reviewed CFD capability CFD system, that those 3 factors are already revised.
Yeah,
you will expect.
Yeah, with the CFD, we're addressing the profitability issue, and we're addressing the risk sharing issue. So that is what the capability-based CFD addresses. The bottleneck issue and the timing issue would be addressed by pushing the deadline, pushing the commercial operation date with 2 years for 2 of the projects, and the last project has a COD date of 2034, which is 2 years later. So we alleviate some of the bottleneck pressures that developers would have.
And then what do you consider to be the most crucial factor for investors in this review?
I'm thinking if I can comment on that. I don't think I can, but hopefully the tender that we've put out that is reflecting what the market and industry had raised of concerns, the tender as it stands now should be addressing those concerns.
And then also that Rebecca mentioned about the UK process, but in Denmark that you had a very intensive discussion with industries as well.
That's right.
And then that was one of the reasons that you formulated this capability CFD.
Yeah, I
My
think
understanding is right.
Yeah, I think if you look at the timeline from when we received zero bid to we actually decided to put out a new tender a year plus a little more, that's been a very intense period for us. And if you look at the changes that have been made from the last tender to the current one, there's been some quite significant, substantial changes. So yes, it's been quite intensive for the people who've been working on this. No doubt about that.
William, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then Rebecca Williams, thank you very much.
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. William, we didn't introduce Mr. William, but Japan and Denmark has established a cooperation agreement in the energy sector, particularly in offshore wind, and William is responsible for that collaboration. Rebecca and William are involved in the policy making at the forefront of that. And Rebecca has been coming to Japan so many times, and she has been meeting with various stakeholders and having a discussion all the time, every time she comes to Japan. In terms of Japan and Denmark relationship, William also come to Japan very often, and both of them are well versed in the situation in Japan. So we are looking forward to their contribution during the panel discussion later on as well. Now, before we move on to the session 2 panel discussion, we would like to introduce a study conducted by the REI. This study analyzes the cost gap between the fixed bottom offshore wind in Japan and Europe, identifies the underlying factors, and explores the potential for cost reduction toward 2040. And the study is being carried out jointly with EGA Insights. Today, the study will be presented by Rike Nogot, CCO and co-founder of EGA Insights, and Mika Obayashi. Both of you, please come up to the stage.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to be here today and have the opportunity to present the results of a brand new study where we look into the cost out potential for fixed bottom wind in Japan towards 2040. The study is, as mentioned, a result of a close collaboration between the RAI and EGA Insights, and will be published in a couple of weeks. But today I will give you an early sneak peek of the results. The study that I will present today is focusing on fixed bottom wind and not floating, because fixed bottom is where Japan's market activity currently is, and is the near-term decisions that are currently being discussed. Cost in offshore wind has always been a topic, but today more than ever, and not least in the context of Japan. We have seen competitive auctions, such as that puts prices very low, and developers struggling to deliver on those prices, resulting in projects being renegotiated, paused, or even cancelled. So this is the context that I will start on today. A brief introduction of myself. I'm Rikke Nørgaard. I have a background working with energy and offshore wind for about 15 years across Europe, UK, Germany, Denmark, and the US. And also across technologies. I've worked on the offshore wind developer side for a decade before founding Ægir Insights. Ægir Insights is an independent offshore wind dedicated intelligence business. We span the globe. We cover all markets, 60 markets, and both existing and potential markets. We serve everything from governments to developers, supply chain, and investors in the sector. We are following all markets globally, spanning about 2,000 projects, and their expected cost levels. We are collaborating with research institutions and governments, providing with data and perspective for the decision-making in the UK, the Nordics, Canada, South Korea, besides Japan. The focus of the study is to deep dive into the existing and expected cost level for offshore wind in Japan. And this study is critical for the future auctions, finding the balance between affordable electricity and competitive incentives for the market. Ægir tracks CapEx data points across regions and markets. And this chart you can see here shows the historical CapEx cost development from the early 2000s across Europe, APAC, and the Americas. You'll note substantial variations that depends on site conditions, local content, policy, and supply chain. We split these development over the past 30 years into 3 key phases. So in the phase A, to the left, that's the early learning phase, where the project benefited from being close to shore and in shallow waters. This was a period of rising costs as projects matured further from shore, and also building out the supply chain. Then we'll have the phase B, and this is the big cost-out phase that happened in Europe, where the mature markets achieved a record low cost with almost zero interest rates and intense supply chain competition. In the latest phase, the phase C, new markets and new challenges has emerged. Localization requirements and early stage challenges has driven costs up. This is also where we find projects in the APAC region. If we look at the current cost level for fixed bottom offshore wind in the APAC region, we see quite a wide span, with several Japanese sites being challenging site conditions, required jackets, and very heavy monopiles, substantial local supply chain requirements adding to increasing cost levels. Risk premiums are also added, depending on if a stable and predictable regulatory framework is in place. In new markets, such as Japan, lower market maturity and less experience translates into package markup and higher contingency. The situation we are faced with today in the global offshore wind sector is that starting a few years ago, we saw increasing interest rates, making financing more expensive, and we saw component supply prices increasing on key components, such as the turbines, around 40%. That meant that subsidy has been introduced again in mature European markets, and is needed to make business cases viable. Cost is very much in focus across all markets in the offshore wind sector. However, macroeconomic signals point towards easing headwinds for offshore wind. We see that the falling interest rates and declining input costs are improving project economics, while policy support is expanding in key markets. Interest rates are easing, improving financing conditions for offshore wind, and we also can see that iron ore, which is a proxy for steel prices, and copper are forecasted to decline due to weaker demand tied to the US trade war. Finally, we have the Chinese OEMs that have not yet entered the global offshore wind market, as seen in other utility-scale energy markets, having the potential of reshaping the cost base in offshore wind. With that background, let's zoom into the potential for offshore wind in Japan. I just wanted to give you this forecast that reflects the updated assessment that EGIA has just completed. And it reflects an increased optimism for Japanese fixed bottom wind that are very much tied to the proposed revision of the auction guidelines for future auction that we see as a positive indicator, as it reduces unrealistic pricing risk going forward, which increases the outlook beyond round 2 and round 3. It's important to mention that this independent forecast considers capacity based on project COD, meaning that capacity is reflected in the year that the project becomes operational. And this is important to mention in the Japanese context, where government targets are sometimes, and also all the forecasts, are based on allocation of projects. But here we forecast in the central scenario, we expect 2.4 gigawatt by 2030, 7.7 gigawatt by 2035, and 14.9 gigawatt by 2040. So there is a lot of capacity coming. Now, let's go into the study. Let's start with a bit of the basics in terms of how to approach such a study. In understanding how projects in Japan direct compare to projects in Europe, a recognized method for comparing costs across regions is looking at the project reference cases. So the objective is to make a like-for-like comparison between current fixed bottom offshore wind cost level in Europe and in Japan. So first, the project scope in Europe. Here we have taken a project in the North Sea. Fundamental different compared to Japan, as you can see here in this illustration. You'll notice that the offshore transmission route is longer in Europe and requires an offshore wind substation structure, which differs from Japan as projects are closer to shore. And the onshore transmission route in Japan is longer compared to Europe. Also, the relevant factors to investigate are the physical site conditions, such as climatic conditions and seabed conditions. I'll just shortly touch on those. As you might know, the deeper water depths are found in the North Sea, where we see longer distance to grid connections in Europe compared to Europe. Wind speeds also differs. We have about 10 meters per second in the North Sea and about 8 meters per second in Japan. On this map, you can see the wind resources that we've capped to areas below 60 meters, and then you can see which areas is the most attractive for fixed bottom. Secondly, complex seabed conditions vary and is a significant structural driver for offshore wind projects in Japan, because we have more challenged seabed conditions here compared to the North Sea. Japan's area have high variable soil profiles, and these conditions increase the likelihood of requiring drilling for the foundation installation, and also alternative methods and design adaptations. Thirdly, we also have different climatic conditions in Japan that drives installation costs that are very much affected by these conditions, such as typhoons and earthquakes, as these affects the component design and also the vessel utilization rate, meaning how long the installation of the project takes. So this was a bit of background, and then going into the study. We use our EGIA quant model, and this is an advanced business case tool which simulates the full business case, taking CapEx, OpEx, production into consideration across the different packages and come up with a view on future costs. This is developed with industry and academia. Here we are comparing the defined reference cases. So the first one, you can see Europe with COD in 2030. We have defined a project capacity of 450 megawatt because that's representative in the project size that are currently being conducted or being installed in Japan towards 2030. Here again, you will notice the differences in terms of water depth, in terms of wind speed, that really drives the capacity factor, which is substantially lower in Japan. And you'll also see the vessel utilization factor is also quite different here compared to Europe. Lastly, the drilling requirements is also present here in Japan. So these are the key differences of the cases that we are comparing. Please just be aware of the difference between CapEx and LCOE. This is a CapEx study. CapEx refers to the upfront capital outlay required to bring an asset into operation, taking all cost components in. So it's a point-in-time cost measure, and it's agnostic to project revenue or operational performance, whereas LCOE is a discounted cash flow metrics that normalizes project's total lifetime cost. So CapEx, OpEx, financing charges against the total expected electricity generation. Good. So, to the result. So these are the key cost differences between a 450 megawatt project in the North Sea to the left and a similar project in Japan to the right. The differences are driven by four factors. So first of all, the relatively hard soil condition in Japan slightly reduces the foundation supply cost because the competent bedrock and shallow water allows monopiles to be shorter and in some cases have smaller diameters, which reduces the cost. The turbine supply costs are higher in Japan due to the additional design requirements driven by the climatic conditions in Japan. So you need to have engineering costs for higher extreme loads and structural robustness, increasing manufacturing complexity and cost. Then you also have the monopile and turbine installation activities that are in Japan are longer and thereby more costly due to the restrictive weather conditions and additional logistical constraints. Transmission costs are lower in Japan compared to Europe because I mentioned the scope is substantially different, shorter distance to shore and no offshore substation. So even though there is longer onshore transmission, the overall cost element is lower in Japan. So in conclusions, we see that the CapEx cost difference is about 13% higher between Europe and Japan fixed bottom with COD in 2030. This might seem little, but if you translate it into LCOE, pre-tax real terms, the gap will be higher, around 40%. And this is almost entirely driven by the wind speed. Then if we look further into the future, towards a project being installed in 2040, here we look at a project with higher capacity, around 1 gigawatt. We see the cost out potential is the combined effect of technology learning, turbine scaling, supply chain maturation, and improved market maturity over the decade. Turbine supply and foundation installation are the most prominent factors, and in LCOE terms, this reduction potential is about 22%. Here we have split the key drivers into two categories. So you can look at it to the left as the structural factors that are harder to address, and a more addressable factor that can be addressed by policy actions. So the addressable factors to the right are important to act on now. Infrastructure investments in ports and supply chain should be initiated now, but require sustained and predictable auction pipelines with price index support like European CFDs. Without this, vessel scarcity and turbine markups persist well beyond 2030. Lastly, this is the key takeaway of the study. So there is a cost gap between Europe and Japan. That's no surprise. It's real. It's not perception. Installation is the most stubborn cost floor that is hard to address due to the structural factors. We see that there is a cost out potential that is within reach with the right policy mix. And we see that there is a window to act now to change the fundamental in order to make offshore wind an important part of Japan's future electricity mix. So it will never reach the same level, the cost level, as we see in Europe due to the structural factors, but the policy reforms and long-term commitments could play an important role. I hope that you find the study results insightful and will be happy to discuss them further this afternoon. Thank you.
Rikke, thank you very much. Maybe that we will have that. I have some questions for you, and then clarify what the study means or something like that. Yeah. 大変失礼いたします。Please use your headset, right? And then you think that it's possible to click to show the slides, or yeah.
Now, I would like to ask several questions. And this time, we conducted this study, and for the first time, we are presenting to you the results of our study. This is not yet finalized. We have some more discussion, and before we publish a final report. Rikke gave explanation earlier, and this time, CapEx. We focused on CapEx. To conduct this study, LCOE conversion, because if we change it to LCOE, the study result will be different. In the case of Japan, LCOE discussion is quite large, and how could it be reflected on the tender system is something people are interested in mostly in Japan. Now, Rikke, once again, we focused on CapEx this time, and I'd like to ask you some questions. Why did you focus on CapEx?
Yeah, a good question. And we also discussed it when we are conducting the study. I think that CapEx is an important metric to take into consideration, as it's a point-in-time cost measure that is important to address in the framework that is being put together currently, because it affects the here now cost and the business case that you are going to take into consideration and make viable specifically for Japan. And there is a lot of all the other relevant metrics that you can also focus on. That's the financing elements, etc. If you take an LCOE into consideration, but this gives a more straight view on the situation.
ありがとうございます。冒頭に言わなく
Thank you very much. I should have said this in the beginning. This study is also jointly conducted by several members from our institute as well, REI. And on the part of REI, Mr. Kimura Keiji is taking the leadership on our part, and because of the university obligation, he is not available today. That is why I am serving as the moderator. Now, let's move into more of the substance of this study. The slide 5. On slide 5, we had a lot of discussion on this, and EGA's future Japan feasibility, deliverability, central case, low case, and high case. There are 3 cases. And from our perspective, it seems to me the projection is quite low. Why is it we have quite low numbers for these cases? For example, in 2030, in low case, 0.2 gigawatt COD. In the central case, even in that case, 2.4 gigawatt COD. So what are the major factors? Although the government has a goal of 5.7, and why is it that we have low numbers?
When we look at expected forecasts built out across the world, we apply the same methodology across all markets, and here we take delay risk into consideration. We look at the regulatory framework, we look at the market maturity situation, and then we assess if a COD, a stated COD, is within reach or if there is potential of it being delayed. So in our central case scenario, we are expecting, as you mentioned, the 2.4 gigawatt by 2030, and this entails a slight delay on some of the projects, but not many. So we have adjusted it up recently since last forecast. And a more low scenario case would mean that you take a more worst case view on the market and the specific projects that are coming near term. On the other hand, in the high scenario, we expect that everything that has been announced goes smoothly, and thereby you can see a higher number there.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Regarding this study, the Japan's higher cost is due to the natural factors, so they are not addressable. However, there are factors which can be addressed through institutional design or policy design. Where is the boundary between these two types of factors?
Yeah, it's a very good question. If we look at the cost study, about 75% of the cost gap is driven by the structural factors, but the remaining 25% is driven by the addressable factors. So that's why it is important to address as many aspects of the 25% that can be addressed now for the longer term. So of course it is the infrastructure investments that needs to be planned and come into place in ports and the supply chain, but also very important, the sustained predictable auction pipeline with price index support is key to get the market going.
So in that sense, there are the East Asian countries which has a similar climate like Japan, for example, Taiwan.
Can you show me the page 3?
Yeah.
Here, we have various costs shown here. In the case of Taiwan, still some are expensive. So maybe we can learn lessons from Taiwan to change our policy. Is it possible?
Yes, what we see here in Taiwan is that we have some very strong local supply chain requirements where the jacket and the monopile fabrication are done locally, while the turbine is being sourced and adapted from Europe. We also have, as you mentioned, similar climatic conditions. I think there are definitely lessons learned in terms of what works and what worked less from Taiwan. But I think it's very important to focus on the situation locally in Japan, being aware of the key drivers that can be addressed and take learnings from the sector from the past 30 years, especially from Europe. But all the kind of structural and climatic conditions can of course be looked at what has happened in Taiwan with their learning rates on installation, etc.
Thank you very much. More specifically, are there what are the factors which can be addressable through a policy? Therefore, within 25%, what are the most amenable areas?
It's about having hitting the right balance between affordable electricity for the end consumer, and then also having the incentives that is needed for the markets to make a business case viable. So I think it's those two factors hitting the right recipe that is not easy, but is necessary to kind of restart the Japanese offshore wind development.
ありがとうございます。じゃあ、ある程度、so if we just continue to explore the offshore wind as a kind of a gigawatt basis, 1 giga, 2 giga, 3 gigas, then we can learn the lessons and then apply for the lower cost of construction, and then we could make the price and then even the cost lower.
Yes.
ありがとうございました。ちょっと待って。
Thank you very much. Regarding this study, when we come up final products, we will have an opportunity to share that with you, and we would like to have your feedback too. Already, we are full audience, so if you have empty seats next to you, please have them available to the audience members who are coming next. Rike-san, Obayashi-san, thank you very much.